Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are, your Masters of Conference, Irina Melnichenko
and Elena Kulish.
So we open UkraineVision 2025, the second day of UkraineVision. This time in a crucial moment. Right now the news from Ukraine is deeply concerning and the future of our country is being decided as we speak. But no matter the challenges, we decide to continue because culture, art, dialogue must not stop. They're part of our resilience. We thank everyone in this room for being here today, and to Sweden and its people, your support really matters, and we are truly grateful. So let's begin. Welcome to UkraineVision 2025.
And before we absolutely start, that was a kickoff. I want to remind everyone that we are broadcasting live and we are making recordings, so we'll be able to watch everything we see right now again. The first panel discussion we'll have is about decolonization. It's called Decolonization from Oppression to Freedom. And it's extremely important right now to remember the long way Ukraine has gone from being oppressed to become a subject of their own history. And now we will speak and gladly hear you all about how important it is to reclaim your own voice, culture, and freedom. Welcome our guests. And I need to present you the moderator, Maria Dahlström. Now I'm giving the word to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very important event. Before we get into the panel today, I want to start with introducing my guests here with me. We have Yuliya Yurchuk, senior lecturer in the history of ideas at Södertörn University here in Sweden, where she focuses on memory studies, religious history and nationalism, with the main focus on Ukraine, Eastern and Central Europe. And your research includes projects on memory politics in Ukraine, propaganda, and uses of history in the Russia-Ukrainian war, as well as religion and politics in Ukraine. And then Anna-Mariia Kucherenko, researcher and curator, who has studied art history, and you are currently involved in projects focusing on preserving and saving images and art, both online as well as physical, with the Archive of Forms and with the Wartime Art Archive, which we'll hear more about later. Yes. And then we have Anton Shebetko, yes, Ukrainian artist, photographer and curator and writer from Kiev, who currently lives in Amsterdam, I believe. And your work is focused on the issues facing the LGBTQH plus community in Ukraine, and themes of memory, loss of identity, multiplicity of history, and the role that photography and archive materials can play in revealing these stories. And Gulnara Abdullayeva, historian, journalist, and author specializing in the history and culture of Crimea and the Crimean Tatars. And Gulnara has worked for Crimean Tatar newspapers, TV and video blogs, and you work with several culture projects that promotes Crimean culture. So welcome to all of you. And we also have an interpreter who will help us today. So for the next hour, we will explore the concept of decolonization and what it means for Ukrainians today. It's quite a strange word. So when you don't know what something is, you do what everyone does today, you look it up on Wikipedia, of course. And this is what decolonization says on Wikipedia. Decolonization is the undoing of colonialism, the latter being the process whereby imperial nations establish and dominate foreign territories, often overseas. The meanings and applications of the terms are disputed. Some scholars of decolonization focus especially on independence movements in the colonies and the collapse of global colonial empires. Critical scholars extend the meaning beyond independence or equal rights for colonized peoples to include broader economic, cultural, and psychological aspects of the colonial experience. Extending the meaning of decolonization beyond political independence has been disputed and received criticism. And I think we should start here with this strange term, decolonization, and what it means to you. Yuliya,
Yeah,
you're
thank
sitting
you.
closest, so would you like
Thank
to
you.
start?
It's very strategic
Yes.
to sit here. Yeah, and basically, when we speak about decolonization now, I want to start by saying that now Ukraine is fighting against colonial war, and now this colonization is taken place when settlers from Russia are resettled to Ukrainian territory. This is the practice of colonization. So this is very classical colonization we are seeing now. And then we are speaking about decolonization. And in this specific situation, we can even speak about decolonization as this resistance and resistance in the war. And the Ukrainian resilience, in a way, becomes this decoloniality, because this is the place of resistance. And speaking about Wikipedia, it was good. I mean, it was even better than some of the critique I've got when I wrote my first book about history writing from decolonial perspective. And so many people, my colleagues, were criticizing me because for them, Ukraine is not a colonial case. So that is why it was not possible for them to kind of let me speak about Ukrainian history and history writing as a decolonial process, because there was no colonization. That is why there was no decolonization. But of course, in 2022, everything changed, and even the same colleagues started saying, yes, yeah, you can say this word now. But this is not funny, really, because it shows how gaslighted we were. And for me, to say it very simply, colonization means living through this constant gaslighting. When you know who you are, when you know which history you have, but you are not allowed to say it, and everyone else, not everyone, but everyone else in power saying to you, no, 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 you didn't have Holodomor. No, 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 you didn't have colonization. No, no, no. Even me, I'm a product a bit of the Soviet Union. I lived in the Soviet Union for 10 first years of my life, and in the school we didn't have a word about when the Second World War started, really. So for me, the Second World War started 1941, and my grandparents were speaking like, oh, when Russians first came. I couldn't really grasp when Russians first came, why they came. And then, of course, I understood that the war started in 1939, and then it all became clear. But this is how this gaslighting is taking place, because you live in this deluded state of mind. And this is decolonial theorists write about how this colonization really influences your psyche, and it's not only a kind of words. It's really how you live, and you constantly feel this conflict in you, and you cannot very often understand what is this conflict.
Thank you so much for those. So interesting to hear that. Because when I talked about the topic with some colleagues, they thought, is Ukraine a colonized country? It's the same. You get the same experience here. And Anna-Mariia, what are your thoughts on decolonization? What it means to you?
Well, I believe that me as a person who mostly as a researcher working with archives, and not archives only their materials, but archives as places of power which hold memories. Actually, I have a presentation. Maybe we can turn it on.
Yeah, sure.
I believe.
Do we have it? The presentation? No, we're checking.
Okay.
Okay,
we can have some time, but
yeah.
I can.
Well, let's come back to that later.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I can. How we better we move on to someone? No, I would like to talk with visuals. So I guess.
I'll pass it on over to Anton then. Decolonization.
Yeah. I mean, I think this panel I'm surrounded by people who are more specialized in this particular topic. But for me personally, I think it's related to being able to see through, smoke and mirrors, and to be able to see the oppressor and being able to name them as such, and being able to dive deep into history and go through these archives, and even to research them with more open-minded approach.
Right, yeah. And Gulnara, you come from the Crimean Peninsula. What's your experience with this?
Так, це для мене наративи, все це деколонізація, це все ж таки усвідомлення цих радянських наративів, які були свого часу і які впливали на наше суспільство, на нашу історію.
Decolonization for me primarily means becoming aware of the narratives which are in the Soviet Union influence our understanding of history in Ukraine.
У випадку Криму це означає повернення голосу корінному народу Криму, кримським татарам.
In the case of Crimea, this concerns the returning of the voice to the Crimean Tatars.
Відновлення історичної справедливості, це і також розвиток своєї мови, своєї культури, своїх традицій.
This is the restoration of historical justice and the restoration of their own language and culture and traditions.
Це таке ж право на своє майбутнє і без впливу цих імперських наративів.
It's a right to have their own future without the influence of imperial narratives.
Тобто через власну волю та міжнародне право.
Through their own will and international law.
Thank you. I mean, there are so many things that make a culture, that define a culture. If you ask a Swede to define a Swede, you will get many different answers. What makes a culture? When do you belong to one, and does it matter? What would you say makes someone a Ukrainian? Can you share some different perspectives on Ukrainian identity? Anton, if you could go first, perhaps. So, what does it mean to be a Ukrainian for you?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think, in the first place, for me, like being Ukrainian is to relate it to having and sharing a certain cultural code, the language, the literature, the songs, something that can be shared between people, and they can recognize themselves in this. So I think for me, the something that makes one person, on one hand, the one thing that will make you, Ukrainian is to be able to recognize yourself within Ukrainian culture. But I think also, like if we're talking about present day, it also can be a conscious choice, of a person. So you can be Ukrainian as, like as political decision, like so. As a nation, you deciding that you're Ukrainian doesn't mean that it that ethnically or nationally wise you're supposed to be, like have some kind of roots. It's a conscious decision that happens day to day, and that also that can change through the time. You can be both Ukrainian and Swedish, and one doesn't have to, oppose another.
Anna-Mariia, do you agree, or is this something else you?
Yeah, I actually think that it's a really interesting and tough question to answer, because when, as a researcher again and a person who works a lot with archives, I've researched my family, for example, and I always understood that I'm not Ukrainian in the sense that my mother is from Kazan, my father also has a very mixed heritage, etc. So for me it was also about having a political choice, especially since 2014, when I understood that being Ukrainian means standing against the imperial project of Russia, and something that was always putting on you and on your mind, because I'm from Kyiv. I was born to the Russian-speaking family. I always felt a little ashamed to be Ukrainian. I always wanted to be Russian for some time of my life. I always were looking and searching for those roots of some Russian bourgeoisie, for example. I always wanted to be a part of this imperial project. And then I realized that, okay, but being Ukrainian is actually fighting against this imperial project for me personally. And now, for example, I don't know much about like folk songs or some traditions still, but I love to think that being a Ukrainian now is just making this political choice to stay in the country, for example, to fight, for example, to support, to be for democracy, to fight for democratic values. So for me, it's more of a political idea of a collective to stick together to one idea and to one goal.
Yuliya?
I just wonder, maybe the PowerPoint is working.
We can,
we will-
later,
okay,
I guess
okay.
we'll have time for it.
Because what I wanted to say, it's really like echo what Anna-Mariia said, because I think that after the Revolution of Dignity, especially this question of a civic nation becomes really important, how Ukrainians see themselves as a really political nation. So you can be born to the family of different backgrounds, different ethnic origins, but it doesn't mean that it excludes you from this polity, the political nation of being Ukrainian. And I think that this is interesting also what I recognize, because I really love all these projects. There are so many now on podcasts, really interesting, on decolonization and how people share their stories, how they decolonize themselves, and what they say actually really resembles what you're saying, because most of them saying that they switched to Ukrainian language. Very often they come from Russian speaking families, and they also speak about this feeling of shame to be Ukrainian or be in Ukraine and trying to be Russian, even more Russian than usual Russians.
Yes.
And then they also say how they discover Ukrainian history, which was kind of silenced, and very often it's the history which was silenced by Soviet Union, and they start recognizing themselves in these histories, and they kind of start understanding the dynamics, the power dynamics, and they choose this side of anti-imperial struggle. And in a way, this anti-imperialism becomes what it means to be Ukrainian in this even context of decolonization. And one more thing, what is also, I think, important, how I see these discussions, that this kind of Ukrainian identity, no matter what, so that person can be from different background, it's kind of understood as a security issue. So if a person chooses to be Ukrainian, then it's a kind of a guarantee for our security and for our victory. And this is something what also is repeated by all those people who are sharing their stories. And I find it very interesting how people kind of connect this self-understanding with victory.
It's interesting. I mean, you don't really think about your identity perhaps until you're under threat and you really have to. But I'm thinking, Gulnara, you're a Crimean Tatar, right? So what does that mean? I think for most Swedish audience, they don't know much about.
Кримські татари – це в першу чергу корінний народ, який сформувався з багатьох цивілізацій, які свого часу приходили до Кримського півострова, які залишили свій слід на Кримському півострові.
Crimean Tatars are a native folk of Crimean Peninsula, and they formed through the influence of different civilizations that left their mark on the peninsula.
Понад 30 етносів, народів, племінних союзів взяли участь в етногенезі кримських татар.
More than 30 different ethnic groups and peoples took part in the formation of the ethnogenesis of the Crimean Tatar nation.
Народ сформувався саме на території Кримського півострова і Причорномор'я.
They formed on the Crimean Peninsula and the territory around the Black Sea.
В 13 столітті, але в 14 столітті сформував вже відтворив свою державу Кримське ханство.
They formed like that in 13th century, but in 14th century they were able to establish their state, the Crimean Hanstvo.
Ця держава була зі своїми власними законами, традиціями і дуже розвитною, як це можна сказати, з дуже потужною дипломатією.
They had their own legal framework, their own diplomacy and culture.
І сьогодні, знаходясь в Швеції, в Стокгольмі, я не можу сказати про те, що Кримське ханство свого часу мало дипломатичні зв'язки саме з королівством Швеція.
Finding myself now in Sweden, I cannot abstain from mentioning that we have diplomatic relations with Sweden.
Наша культура – це унікальний симбіоз Східу та Заходу.
Our culture is a unique symbiosis of East and West.
І це все відобразилося в мистецтві, в музиці, в літературі, в культурі взагалі.
You can see it in music, history, literature.
Наша мова належить до тюркських мов, і я можу сказати, що кримсько-татарська мова є унікальна серед тюркських мов. Якщо знаєш кримсько-татарську мову, то ти можеш розуміти й інших тюркські народи.
Our language belongs to the Turk family of languages, but our language is unique because if you understand Crimean Tatar, you can understand other Turkic languages.
І сьогодні, коли ми говоримо про кримських татар, я не можу не згадати, так, в нас був розцвет, в нас був дуже такий підйом, коли в нас була своя держава, але я не можу не згадати і про те, що в нас були дуже такі темні сторінки історії.
I was talking about the acme of Crimean Tatar culture, but I also have to say that we had many black spots of our history.
І в першу чергу це перша окупація Кримського півострова в 1783 році, коли Кримське ханство було окуповано Російською імперією.
The first one is 1783 when we were occupied by the Russian Empire.
Друге, це, звичайно, така найпотужня, це був геноцид проти кримсько-татарського народу, це 1944 рік, коли кримських татар депортували в Середню Азію та на Урал.
In 1944, we experienced genocide when many Crimean Tatars were deported to recesses of Russia to Siberia.
І тільки спустя 10 років зародилося потужний такий національний рух кримських татар за повернення на родину, на батьківщину.
In 10 years, there were born a movement of Crimean Tatars for the sake of returning to their native land.
Тобто це є така боротьба за повернення на батьківщину, за відновлення своїх прав. І зараз мені дуже приємно, що дуже багато країн вже визнали геноцид кримсько-татарського народу. Це і страни Балтії, це Польща і дуже багато інших країн. Вже визнають, це справжній геноцид, який відбувся з кримсько-татарським народом.
This movement was concerned with the right to return to the native land, and now I'm happy that many countries are beginning to recognize the genocide of the Crimean Tatars, for example, Poland and the Baltic states.
Для мене кримсько-татарська ідентичність – це в першу чергу пам'ять про минуле і гордість за наше майбутнє.
First of all, for me, the Crimean Tatar identity is the pride about one's history and hope about the future.
Звичайно, я дуже багато можу розповідати взагалі про історію кримських татар, але я розумію, що час трошки обмежений, тому якщо буде потім якісь питання стосовно кримсько-татарської історії, кримських татар, я залюбки на це відповім.
I understand that the time constraint does not allow me to tell everything I know about Crimean Tatar history, but I will be happy to mention it or talk about it again if discussion touches it.
Thank you, Gulnara. How does Russia, who have occupied the Crimean Peninsula, how do they treat the Tatars that are still there?
Так, дякую за питання. Я просто дійсно треба було сказати, ще в нас ми пережили вже другу окупацію в 2014 році.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's important to mention that in 2014 we left through another occupation.
І я можу сказати, що саме з перших днів дійсно окупанти, які прийшли на нашу землю, вони також дуже тиснули на кримсько-татарське суспільство, на проукраїнське суспільство. Тобто ми вимушені були виїжджати з Криму, тому що дуже багато кримських татар залишилося в Криму, але вони не приймають окупацію.
Yeah, from the very first day we were pressed and trampled by the occupying power, and many of us were forced to leave Crimean Peninsula, but some Tatars are staying, but they are under pressure all the time.
Але дуже сильно відчувається оця, якби, тому що видавлюють кримських татар з півострова, це умови такі создаються для того, щоб кримські татари як більше виїжджали і засіляли вже російське населення в Криму. І це факти, коли завозять про дуже багато росіян до Криму зараз.
The occupying force tries to create conditions of pressure that compels more and more Crimean Tatars to leave the Crimean Peninsula so that Russia can replace them with the settlers from Russian territory.
Як ми знаємо, зараз в Криму дуже багато тих, хто не згоден з політикою окупантів, тобто росіян, вони зараз дуже багато серед кримських татар зараз знаходяться в тюрмах, дуже багато арештів, хто не зміг виїхати, і він якби висловлював свою думку, так, і цих людей просто або притісняли, або просто заарештовують зараз. І дуже багато ми маємо на сьогодні, дуже багато заарештованих кримських татар, в'язнів російських тюрем.
We know that there are many people in Crimea right now who do not agree with the fact of the occupation and with some of the policies that occupation brings with itself, but many of them are right now jailed, imprisoned. They're facing charges, and the situation for them is not very pleasant.
Але незважаючи на все те, що вже минуло 10 років, це дуже багато, але все одно кожен кримський татарин в Криму, кожен українець в Криму сьогодні мріють про той час, коли де-факто, де-юре Крим – це український, а де-факто Крим повернеться в состав України.
And despite the fact that it's been more than 10 years after the occupation, we know that many Ukrainians and Tatars in Crimea are still waiting to be liberated and waiting to return to Ukraine.
Thank you for sharing that. So speaking of identity, I would like to quote a line from the Ukrainian national anthem. And it goes like this. Soul and body shall we lay down for our liberty, and we shall show, O brethren, that we're a Cossack family. Who were or are the Cossacks, and what does that identity mean for Ukrainian? And some in the audience laugh. So interesting.
I used to say to my students, Cossacks are freedom-loving countrymen. So these are people who are working on the land. They were working on the land. Very often it was not their land. So they decided to leave their places and become free. And then they started kind of grouping, and then they had their own state. But first in the very beginning, this is the freedom-loving people who just decided, no, it's enough and we are free.
So do you identify as Cossacks?
I have a Cossack surname.
We have the anthem and we are singing it
Yes.
like every day, of course.
Interesting. Well, speaking of identifying, I mean, for most part of the 1900s, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and some of you grew up in that, some are younger than that. But what do you remember from the years when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, or what your parents have told you, and how did things change when Ukraine was a sort of a free country? Anna-Mariia, would you like to start?
Well, I was born in 2001, so but my parents didn't like Soviet Union much. My mom forgot her mother tongue language, for example. My dad also didn't use Ukrainian much because it was just not necessary. And if you wanted to study in a nice school or go to the university, you spoke Russian. My grandmother, who is 90 years old, she said she was okay because she was born in like 1935 and she lived through World War II, etc. But by the way, it's funny because she told me when Yushchenko became a president, she understood that Soviet Union was actually really bad. So it's about cultural policy. And by the way, my presentation is downloaded, so we can also talk about it later.
Yeah, let's come back to that.
Okay, let's come back to
it. Yes, so anyone else? Yuliya, sort of...
About family?
Yeah, so growing up, Soviet Union versus sort of Ukraine.
Yeah, as I said, I was born in Soviet Union, so I still remember when Ukraine became independent. And in my family, we always kind of knew that Ukraine would become independent one day. I lived in this through this for 10 years. And then when finally Ukraine became independent, I wouldn't say that I was surprised, but I remember this moment. I see the news on the TV and I start crying. It was during the day. My parents were somewhere else, so they were working, I guess. And I was alone at home, and I got to know Ukraine is independent. So the results came. I was crying, and then I ran to neighbors because I wanted just to be with people and to share the news. And and the neighbors were maybe not showing the enthusiasm in a way I was showing it, but they also kind of, oh yeah, and they were also children because their family, their parents were as well somewhere working, and we were kind of having this childish celebration, let's say.
Anton, I mean, you're also a young person.
Yeah.
Yes. But your parents what have
I was born in '90, so only had 1 year of Soviet Union, so it didn't really shape my identity in any way. And to be honest, I never really had this identity crisis in terms of like, who am I? If like talking about political country, you know. So I always consider myself Ukrainian, and my family, as far as I know. Soviet Union definitely impacted them, you know, in a certain way, and their view on the world. It's definitely impacted my grandmother, for example, who I think was the most identity confused in the family, because you know, like the system she lived in for most of her life basically broke down, and then you have like this very painful year, and she was already not young at that time, you know, when this new country basically started to exist, when Ukraine gained independence. So for me, it was never really a problem, but I do understand that like the, let's say, Russian culture was still present very prominently in Ukraine. I think this is basically the way, like how you, like Russia always used culture as a soft power, and I would say quite smartly. And it was always, you know, like luring people in, you know. It's also not only about the laws, you know, laws in country, you know, like during the Soviet time, for example. But it's also about opportunities. It's not like repression can go from what opportunities are available for you, depending on how you identify, which language do you speak, you know, what music do you listen to, what books you are reading. So this is the law. This is the way. I think this is how shaped a lot of people, not in a positive way.
And Gulnara, so in the Crimean Peninsula, how was this growing up for you and for your parents?
Ну, я не можу сказати, що якось там Крим відрізнявся від всієї України, тому що ми дійсно проживали. Я не пам'ятаю сама ці радянські часи, так, хоча я народилася в цей період, а це, звичайно, більше від батьків я дізнавалася про все це. Ну,
I don't think there was a huge difference between how we experienced it in Crimea as distinct from Ukraine. I was born in Soviet Union, but I don't really remember anything from that period.
І я можу сказати, що це були саме найгірші, напевно, часи, коли постійно були такі, знаєте, наративи. Це тільки через призму нав'язаної держави, яка була на той час СССР, яка нав'язувала свої тільки стереотипи. Не було ні української історії, ні кримсько-татарської історії, взагалі про мову. І я, до речі, хочу сказати, що в Криму на той час взагалі українську мову не восприймали. І це була така державна політика.
I have to say that what I know is that in the Soviet period it was quite a dark time because the narratives were very state-enforced, and in Crimea, for example, we did not have any Ukrainian language or culture included in the cultural upbringing.
Крім того, я хочу сказати, що в радянські часи просто знищували всю ту матеріальну культуру, яка належала, наприклад, корінному народу, кримським татарам, караїмам, кримчакам, які проживали на території Кримського півострова. Це все знищувалося, це все просто вимивалося, щоб сказати, що тут є корінними росіяни.
Soviet Union orchestrated a campaign to destroy many material artifacts of Crimean Tatar culture.
Єдине, що в нас залишилося, це така дуже, я можу сказати, одинична така можливість, залишився ханський палац кримських ханів, тому що свого часу туди якоби приїжджав сам Пушкін. Тому через це залишився цей ханський палац, а то його також знищили. Ага. Тобто його би знищили знов. Добре, я...
Sorry, I was distracted a little bit.
Добре, Ханський палац залишився тільки тому, що свого часу туди приїжджав російський поет Пушкін. І він написав свою поему «Бахчисарайський фонтан», і тому Ханський палац залишили тільки того, що там був цей російський поет.
Yeah, one of the artifacts which remains is the Han Palace in Bakhchisarai, but the only reason why it was spared is because Pushkin visited it and wrote some of his poems there.
І ось уявляєте собі такий момент, коли в радянських підручниках того часу писали, взагалі, про Україну не писалося взагалі, ну, тобто, коли я ще навчалася, а про кримських татар взагалі такого слова кримські татари не було, були якісь міфічні татари Золотої Орди, і коли казали про них, що вони якісь там загарбники, вони щось там робили не так, і це клас весь дивився на мене.
We didn't know really a lot about Ukraine. Not much was written about anything Ukrainian, but when it concerns the Crimean Tatar identity, it was just completely mythical. And when in the classroom Crimean Tatars were mentioned, it was mostly in a negative sense, and the whole classroom looked at me when Crimean Tatars were mentioned.
Really?
Я хочу сказати, і це дало мені такий поштовх, щоб я свого часу поступила на історичний факультет і все ж таки докопалася, а що насправді як було. Тому що дуже багато було таких моментів, було таких подвійних стандартів. З одного боку нам казали, що от такого не було, це було так жахливо. З іншого боку виявлялося, що зовсім інше було і відбувалося насправді. І те, що залишилося, архітектурні якісь пам'ятки, те, що я слышала від батьків, які книжки я читала свого часу, які були свого часу під запретом в радянські часи. Ну, тобто, це на початку, можна сказати, такі моменти були, коли мої батьки читали такі книжки, і вони мене розповідали все це. І це все змусило мене поступити на історичний факультет, щоб більше дізнатися про це, що відбувалося. Но мені пощастило, що я вже не була в радянські часи, і я освіту отримала дуже таку ґрунтовну.
So I was inspired to go and attend the historical department at the university, partly because of this blind spots in the education, because I understood that something was lacking. Also, the information which I was getting from my parents, who were telling me some stories about their past and sharing some histories and sharing some material cultural artifacts with me.
Thank you. Speaking about schools and school system, how is Ukrainian history taught in schools in Ukraine today? what is sort of the narrative of the nation that you are taught? Any of you have any knowledge about this?
The
Well,
younger generation.
Younger generation, yes.
Yeah, then we can go from maybe from young to older,
Yes.
so we can compare.
Yes.
I finished school in 2018, I believe, and I don't remember exactly if there were any nation formatting history. I think it all depends on the teacher, right? So I think it was just very smooth, and we spoke about Crimea, for example. We spoke about two empires, Russian Empire, and like how we were shared between Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc. So that's why I guess for me it's always was a confusing question what being Ukrainian means actually. Of course, we studied about Cossacks, about like 20th century, etc. But everything was very neutral. I believe. Again, I'm from Kiev, I studied there in school, and the city has always been very, I think, Russia-centric, and my teacher, he wasn't like that, but he was very neutral, like, here is your information. So.
And Anton?
I mean, so I finished school in 2006, and it was a long time ago, so for me it's very difficult to recall what exactly we've been taught like, in the history lessons, but what I remember that my teacher hated Soviet Union, so I'm pretty sure it's really shaped her views and the curriculum, what we've been taught.
Cool.
And Yuliya, you sort of...
As I said, I still remember. I feel like dinosaurs here. But okay. Yes, when Ukraine became independent, we didn't have the history textbooks because you need time to write a history textbook. And we were using Orest Subtelny book on history of Ukraine. And Orest Subtelny is a historian from Canada, from Canadian diaspora, and I would say that it was a supplement not only in my school but in many other schools, because then I researched this topic, how we kind of transitioned from the Soviet history education to Ukrainian history education, and this is like the fact that a lot of schools use this book, and of course diaspora history writing was very different. First of all, it was taking place in the democratic country. On the other hand, it was written very often by the people who had their own family memories from post-war Ukraine, or even before the Second World War. And this experience also influenced how they wrote about history. But of course, Orest Subtelny, he wrote about such topics which were not even mentioned in the Soviet books, like, as I said, the famine, and then the nationalist resistance during the Second World War, so Bandera and all this stuff, and even the killings of Polish population by Ukrainian nationalists. It was mentioned there, but very, very shortly. So I would say that it was a good start, and and then of course there come new books, and this is what you already heard about them.
Right. So. Okay, let's move on. But Anna-Mariia, I think, should we see your presentation now?
Yes, I want also people to see my design skills.
Yes, let's go. Let's see if we can roll it.
Yeah, very minimalistic. So basically, that what I guess it's answering your first question, because I wanted to give a longer answer. So that's basically how, as a person who works with archives, I define how archiving became a tool of decolonial practices. Next slide, please. So first, I really wanted to say that, as we all know, Ukrainian culture now is under the threat of the liquidation. And what I see as a researcher and as a person who lives in Ukraine and always tracking different grassroots initiatives, I see what I borrowed from Hal Foster archival impulse, which I can sense in the air. What I mean by that, that many people have an urge to collect, preserve, and archive everything what's going on. It's about culture, but it's also about the images of war and Russian crimes, etc. And many initiatives like this have appeared in Ukraine since 2014, since 2022 it's became even more of them. And by this archive impulse, I refer to two practices. The first one is to collect and to preserve, but on the other hand, it's also to make visible, to show, to unarchive, which I also borrowed from another scholar. But for me, as a woman, as a person from Ukraine, as also a person who studied humanitarian science, archive was also always a structure of power. Since the 20th century, it was also always a discussion about, okay, archive preserves something, but who is the person who preserves? Why I said as a woman, because from the feminist perspective, it's always a man, for example. From the perspective of Ukrainian who is oppressed, it's always a colonial power. It's always Russian or Soviet regime who were deciding, okay, we preserve this and you have access only to this knowledge. But right now, when we are in the situation that we are becoming more and more self-definitive, I understand that creating an archive is becoming a new step against this oppression and decolonization, basically. So I think also digital archives, which I will talk about more, I won't take a lot of time, but I will talk about them a little more, is basically also a tool of democratization of this archival power, because it gives more people space to contribute, and it gives more voices to shape this collective memory. Can we have a next slide, please? So first, I want to show you quickly two initiatives. The first one is wall evidence. It's basically also a grassroots initiative that become more institutionalized, as we can say. It's what those people are doing, basically, their teams, they are taking wall evidences, what Russian soldiers have left, which are basically very temporary memories, because some of them are written just by the market, so it's easily to just, get rid of it, but they take pictures of it, or they found them on internet, they gather those images. For me, it's also very important that Ukrainians are trying to preserve evidences made by ordinary Russian soldiers, and what they really think of and what they are really going through in terms of, like, they deciding to draw or they deciding to write on this UK flag it's actually just an absurd words. So can you please show the next slide? Also, another important initiative, but before I also want to say one quick word, is that actually, as we all nowadays have smartphones, we all started to contribute to this archive of evidences, for example, of a Russian aggression in Ukraine. And what I believe it's also a thing of creating this archival multitude and different voices. And for example, this archive is basically based only on people's voices, because it's a Mariupol Drama Theater special archive, which is especially special archive of a temporary community on one place, but also of a war crime. So when the Mariupol wasn't under occupation but was in hostilities, many people were hiding in the drama theater in the city center that got bombarded, and many people were killed. But those who survived, they left the city. They went to Ukraine or to other European countries, and they started to share their memories to this team. And by this, they created first the space of the Mariupol theater, how it operated inside as a temporary communities where the space changed its purpose, basically. But also it's a story of collecting memories of people. And as we know, one of the Russian neo-colonial approach is reshaping memories. Russian destroyed the ruins of the Mariupol theater just to make it, this have never happened. there was no war crimes, there was no this temporary community. And this is one of their strategies. So it's reshaping of Mariupol's collective memory. And by creating this archive, it gives us first the information of this war crime, but also it gives a people right to tell what have happened and shape this memory once again. It's didn't start as a grassroots initiative, what I said, but it's something a really small team have been working for really, really long. And it's only just one case of a city that is still occupied, and we don't know, like, I think we all know the events, and we don't know how long it will take for us to come to Mariupol and actually investigate what happened. Can you show next slide, please? Thank you. So basically, my point in showcasing these two different archives, and now I will tell more the part of which I am, is to highlight that archive became a shared self-definitive act of resistance and decolonization, and it allows us to shape memories that are not influenced by colonial perspective. And so the Wartime Art Archive is basically an archive by UkraineVision of Contemporary Art. It started as a grassroots initiative, and my three other colleagues, Olga, Helena, and Tatiana, started doing it basically on the 25th of February, the next day after the full-scale invasion, as they saw that many artists started posting art on social media as an answer to the Russian aggression. And they started to preserving it by taking screenshots and put it to the Google folder, basically. Next slide, please. Thank you. Right now, the archive becoming more and more shaped, I would say, and it's becoming more methodologically clear for us. Because when we started doing it, it was also an impulse, a reaction. Okay, we want to preserve all those artistic reactions on what have happened, because social media become a very safe space for many of us, and also it became, for example, the only way how to see it's what actually yesterday we talked about unseen forces, about the resistance, about those artists who were in the occupation, and the only way how to see what's going on there basically was seeing their artworks on social media, just to know that the person is alive. And so the archive is built on the time frame, which is very important for us because all the artworks are a reaction to a certain event. And can you show the next slide, please? Thank you. So here you can see, for example, I think many of you can even remember some of those days when those artistic works were created. All of them are for social media, and for us it's very important that we showcase only what artists wanted to show, what they've done and what they wanted to put on social media. I think it's also a very important strategy when we talk about these structures of power, that you just showcasing what is basically on the internet, right? It's just doubling the information, but we gather it, we tag it, we have a tag system. We are trying to make it easier for people in the future to navigate and understand what have been happening for different scientists, maybe for anthropologists, sociologists. So here is what I call social media role, because also many artists reflected on images they saw on the social media. So can you show the next slide, please? Oh, yeah. Very minimalistic too. What I wanted to say is that archiving nowadays became, it's changed its perspective a little bit from the structure of power to the act of resistance as decolonization, of trying to give us our own voice. And as a team who is working right now on creating this methodology, more academic, etc., as we all started again as a grassroots initiative first, I would say that for us, the problem of decolonization and what Yuliya said, for example, that from the perspective of many European academia, Ukraine have never been a colony. We are basically right now also working on a project which we hopefully will do with our Swedish colleagues about Sami and the experience of Sami people, how they were part of, how they were oppressed and how they were colonized and how they found their way to have their own voice. But also we want to work it from the perspective of Ukrainian artists who visited also northern tribes from Russia, who showcased their lifestyle before they were basically, their lifestyle was genocided and they didn't have the opportunity to find their voice. So for us, this topic of decolonization right now, I think, and since 2022, is one of the main points we are focusing our work on, and also to find this language, how to describe what's have been going on with us.
Thank you so much, and such important work that you do.
Thank you.
I think so. Applause for that.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm a museum curator, so I mean, my work is all about saving stories and memories and objects.
To curate is to care, basically. So.
Because what happens today will be history tomorrow, and so very important work.
Thank you.
And I'm thinking about this sort of. Now you've been talking about preserving history, but the opposite is to eradicate. And part of warfare and of colonialism is the eradication of local history. For example, a conqueror, colonizer might change the name of rivers, mountains, streets, or even whole cities. I mean, names are very political. I mean, just the other week, I think a certain president in a country to the west wanted to change the name of a mountain in Alaska. Yeah. So do you have any such examples from Ukraine that you know of, where so the occupying powers have changed names or removed? Yuliya, do you know any?
Actually, we had a lot of renaming going on, especially after 2014. But, for instance, like Dnipropetrovsk became Dnipro. But it's not only this example, because after 1991, when Ukraine became independent, a lot of streets were renamed. So this process started actually even before we had the name of this process. So it was just renaming the streets. And some villages, towns. And what is happening on the when Russians occupy the territories now, they come back to those names which were before the renaming, the Ukrainian renaming. And what is especially interesting for me, because I studied the monuments for many years, that how Russians destroyed the monuments which were built after 1991 in these territories that they occupy, and also how they, and this is a very serious kind of propaganda tool, because they are making videos as if they reconstruct the Soviet monuments to Red Army soldiers, for instance, which is not true, because they were never destroyed in the first place, but they show it as, oh, we are coming and we are liberating not only people, we are liberating also the monuments. And this is, I think, a part of propaganda which is not even coming to us. We never discuss it, at least in the West, never. But this is what is going on, and they use all means possible to just show themselves in this, for us, of course, disgusting manner, but it is sold, so to say, in Russia and for Russians.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it doesn't have to be names. It could be sort of traditions, songs, stories, crafts that were forbidden or forgotten. Is there anything like that that now has sort of been brought back to life as a sort of a part of a resistance? Gulnara, maybe?
Дійсно, сьогодні є в Криму дуже величезний спротив тому, що відбувається зараз. І якщо попереднє питання було про топоніміку, я хотіла би трошки також сказати саме про Крим.
Yes, there is a process of resistance like that in Crimea. So if the previous question was about toponymy, I can say a word about Crimea in this regard.
Після того, як кримських татар депортували в 1944 році, вже почалися змінювати всі назви саме в Криму. Топоніміка практично вся змінилася. І в 1948 році практично всі назви були змінені.
Yeah, after the deportation of 1944, almost immediately, all the names which were connected to Crimean Tatar identity were substituted by other names, and by the year 1948, this process touched all the names.
Тобто змінилося практично все. Ахяр більше став називатися Севастополем, Ахмеджит став називатися Симферополем.
So, for example, Agyar was recalled as Sevastopol, Akhmedji as Simferopol.
Тільки залишилася одна єдина назва Бахчисарай. Це колишня столиця Кримського ханства. Її просто не змогли змінити. Але я хочу сказати, що завжди в кримсько-татарському суспільстві всі ці назви, які були топоніми, які були в Криму, досі і до останнього використовують саме кримсько-татарські назви.
The only name which remained was Bakhchisarai, which was the capital of the Crimean Tatar Hanstva, but I want to say that all of the names are still in use by the Crimean Tatars who remain in Crimea.
Сьогодні також суспільство готове к тому, що вже українське суспільство готове к тому, що коли ми будемо повертатися в Крим, а ми обов'язково туди повернемося, то вже держава Україна, вона прийняла закон про деколонізацію, про зміну назв, саме повернення історичних назв Криму.
Now the Ukrainian nation had decided, due to its law of decolonization, that when Ukraine returns to Crimea, the old names will be restored.
Тому що для українців, наприклад, сказати Ахяр, чи, наприклад, Кефів за місто Феодосія, більш притаманно, ніж, наприклад, росіянам.
So it might be that for Ukrainians to say Adyar or Kefir will be for Ukrainians more natural than for the Russians.
And do any of you know of any crafts or traditions that were suppressed when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and that now are sort of being brought back?
Even, like this embroidery shirts and these crafts, they were suppressed in a way that they were folklorized in a very kind of unnatural way. So
negative?
And kind of unified, like without this diversity which was before. And this is something what is also very tricky, because on the one hand you still have some kind of embroidery in this very folkloristic manner, but without any history behind it. So this is also very interesting way to see how this kind of colonization is happening by also preserving some parts of culture. But some things were not possible, like some songs which are really very connected to this kind of nationalist, anti-Soviet movement. Then it's a problem, of course. But if it's not that problematic in a way, not expressing this resistance, then it was okay.
Any other examples? Should we move on? We're running out of time soon.
But we started later.
Yes.
I would say that probably not, but well, first of all, we are the first generation of Ukrainians who have the access to the full archive, I would say, of our visual culture, for example, of songs, of poetry, of literature, etc. And for us, it's actually still a question of always reopening of those who were reopening, etc., etc. So I don't know about maybe folklore part, but I would say, for example, that we had a huge number of poets and literature and even visual arts. They were banned in the Soviet Union, for example, until the 1960s, and that were freely open only in the 1995. So we have a modernist tradition that was basically cut. That's why, for example, Ukrainian contemporary art is very different from when I always go to the Western European Contemporary Art Museum. You know, you see this tradition. You see like conceptual art influence dancing, etc. La la la. But in Ukraine, this tradition was just basically cut in the 1920s, which is maybe less about folklore, but more about modernity that also was suppressed.
I have a lot more questions, but we're running out of time, actually. So, perfect.
Please. Yeah, thank you. I saw that arm first, and I'll come back to you later.
Okay. My name is Per Brettam. The title of this is Decolonization from Oppression to Freedom. And then the fact that Russia or the state under all its different names and whatever has always been, an empire on its own continent. Does that affect how both its colonization process, but also how others view the colonization? I mean, we tend to see like, oh, we're colonizing other countries far, far away. So how does that kind of interact?
Historians used to say that Russia doesn't meet this salt water test because its colonies are all on the ground, and this is land which is like a neighboring lands which the Russia colonizing. But actually this is it doesn't exclude the fact that it is colonizing it, and so many nations now are part of Russian Federation which have this very colonized status, and there is actually the movement inside this peoples to decolonize, and this is also interesting to see how even now Russia is using those people in the war in Ukraine, because this is how usually empires work. They use the colonized, and this is the source, right? And they become the source in the war. This is the human sources.
Did you get the answer for your question?
I also wanted to know how it affects how Russia can affect us to think about how it is not being a colonizing empire.
Yeah, because you know we got used to think about colonization, that this is like Europeans coming to other continents, and that is why many Europeans have it difficult to understand that it can be also within one continent.
That's a problem of Eurocentric history, basically. That's what we are talking about.
We have one more question.
And I think it's also like Russia, like Soviet Union, spent so much money and time working with Western academias to pursue the idea that, for example, Soviet Union was not an empire, but it was like anti-colonial, basically. The group of countries. So I think this is just like the part of the narrative that it goes from far back, you know, that is still impacting our today's view.
Thank you.
Дуже дякую. My question is actually related. Problem is in the concept decolonization, because it's the most of the literature is focusing on the subjects under British or French or American colonies, and the most of literature is about the non-Western European subjects under the Western European big powers. In this way, we simplify West as one unity, and we also sometimes forget sometimes that just calling themselves colonialized people makes them innocent for colonialization. Let's say, for example, Arabic or Chinese colonies. We don't see them as colonizer because they are not Western Europeans. How do you, what is your, when you are interacting with spokesmen or philosopher around it, how is the reaction to these many people who are letting up the idea of decolonialization? And when you are talking about Ukraine, who is, sorry for the stereotype, white people who are colonized?
But this is a very important question, because then we can speak about different colonizations, because I think this is very difficult to claim that this process is one for everyone, and the Soviet Union was involved in very complicated relations, because the Soviet Union was kind of trying to decolonize some countries by employing Ukrainians, Belarusians, or other nations, or soldiers from Ukraine, for instance, and they were in the colonizing position then, right? And this is a very complicated story. But this is not kind of exclusive in this specific situation, right? And this is something what should be also kind of approached in a very detailed level and a deeper level, also in Ukrainian history writing, to show these complexities. And then it's possible to build solidarities when you speak about this mechanism of colonizations, which were often the same. And about whiteness, it's also very interesting, because in decolonial theory, race and gender are seen as these Eurocentric concepts which were brought to other continents. And here we see a different story, and also not that simple, because even this whiteness is seen in a different way, because you are not as white as Russian.
Yeah,
you are not as white, you know? And that is why I think this now there is a lot of this critical whiteness studies and everything. I think this is something what can be inspiring in a way how to approach it. But I don't think that there is one size for everyone here, because we should really approach it. And we had this interaction with our colleagues from Kazakhstan, for instance, and how they see this. So I wouldn't claim that, oh, we are all together in this process and we are doing the same stuff. No, not at all.
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to announce we have 2 more questions.
Wow.
Thank you. So I was reflecting about, you've been talking about the Russian colonization and the Soviet one, and now there is a new phenomenon here with the American administration and Donald Trump's proposal to grab a lot of Ukrainian resources. What do you think? What do you think about that, and ways to counter this? Also, a different type of colonial concept.
Well, you know, sorry, it's just I want to quote here a term which my colleague Asa Basdareva once used, which is called resourcification of a country. That's what basically have been going on in Ukraine since, we may say, even Soviet times, because when we talk about, I think you remember when Kakhovka Dam was exploded, and by Russian bomb, how you call this mechanism, it destroyed an ecosystem. But when it was built first for resources, and where Dnipro gas was built also for resources, for factories that were creating weapons, Soviet weapons that would fight America in 1930s, it also destroyed a lot of local ecosystems, etc. So I think it's basically the story repeating itself, as Ukraine is a grain basket of Europe, Ukraine as a resource for Soviet industry, and Ukraine which is seen as a resource, and people who are seen as a resource. So I think it's a very, it has its durability in our history, which is also a thing we are trying to fight against and have this agency. But for now, what's better, to be a resource for the United States or being killed in Russian prison? I prefer to be a resource. So.
Thank you. And a last question for now.
Sorry, it's rather common than question, but as a philosopher and person from the side of methodology, who respects methodology a lot, I'm in all the time fights about this colonialism concept in general. Just let's be honest, the funniest joke in this methodology field of last year was that British Museum actually provided that decolonization guide for Ukrainian museums. Isn't it nice? And I thought that that was quite a joke, to be honest. And these decolonizing studies are mostly led by ex-colonizers, not the colonies. And nowadays we have this issue that, look, Ukrainians want to tell us something, how to change the framework. Because we finally kind of regaining the agency, and probably we definitely have a very different and diverse experiences with our African mates, with our, behind the sea mates, but we have a way more to share and to understand, and this scene have to be from the first subject, not from those which colonized and then teach us how to decolonize ourselves the best way, right? And in Ukraine, this is a great novel. I think that for me, there was such a pleasure of mature literature to read. This is A Road to Asmara by Serhiy Senhaivsky. It's now in translation. I believe they're going to be published for next years, which is actually what Yuliya mentioned, that Ukrainians were part of this colonization in Asia as well. And this is a great reflection from one military who was part of those big actions. And he tries to understand what actually he is doing there through the whole military journey. I absolutely, when you'll find that it's translated, this is one of the best reflection from both sides at the very same moment. And how
actually,
you
he
can
shows
become...
how the Soviet Union is using famine to in Ethiopia.
Yeah.
So it's really... And famine is an instrument of colonization.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much for your comment. Thank you, our panelists, for a great and thoughtful discussion. Stay where you are, we have presents for you. I have announcement that now we have a break till 4 p.m. and the next panel starts at 4, so feel free to breathe air, have coffee, enjoy, maybe harass our panelists for some questions. You mentioned Cossacks during the conversation, and I want to remind everyone that tomorrow we have a concert of Kozak Siromacha, and the tickets are still available. So grab your chance, enjoy the concert. And thank you so much.